Welcome back to the Nature for Life Hub. Over the past 2 days, we discussed nature-related finance, policy, and practice challenges. Today, we turn to perhaps the most fundamental lever of change of all, the value shift. Beneath the surface of our economic and political systems lies our collective narratives and our shared values. These exert strong influence, often subconsciously, over what is seen as possible, permissible, and valuable. These narratives and values have the power to determine which policies gain traction, which investments receive support, and which futures we dare to imagine. Today, we explore 3 dimensions of this value shift. First, the power of narrative. How do we transform the stories of our relationships with nature to better capture the public's imagination and create more political space for bolder action? Second, the decision-making architecture. How do we shape the systems and incentives that guide leaders to make more nature-positive choices? And finally, the principle of equity. How do we ensure that the voices, rights, and priorities of Indigenous peoples, local communities, youth, and rural populations are far closer to the centre of environmental decision-making? We begin with the power of narrative. There are a variety of nature narratives in circulation, some of which assert the importance and superiority of humans over their environment, others which alarm us with extinction rates of wildlife and ecosystem destruction, sometimes to the point where we'd rather not hear more. But most pervasively, there is the nature versus development narrative, which suggests that nature conservation is only at odds with economic and development interests. At their best, narratives can elevate the value of nature in our everyday lives, but at worst, they are pitting people against nature. This is why narratives are a key part of the Nature Pledge's value shift and central to our discussion today. So how do we elevate the value of nature so that it's considered the driving reason for a new era of human flourishing? And how do we make the foundational value of nature impossible to ignore in economic and political choices? Our first dialogue is with the remarkable Peter Julian, who works at the intersection of science and storytelling. Hosting this discussion is Sean Lees, UNDP's Nature Pledge Coordinator for Asia and the Pacific. Sean works to facilitate the transformative shifts in our approaches to nature, integrating nature-based solutions into sustainable development practices. Let's listen in.
Do we need to deploy new narratives?
Transforming a lot of that frustration into what can we urgently do? There certainly needs to be a point of engagement.
Is labeling nature as an economic asset involve any trade-offs?
We need to begin thinking about our planet in terms of resilience. We need to make some different decisions.
Peter, welcome to the Nature for Life Hub Dialogue.
Thank you.
For years, people like yourself, people like me, environmentalists have focused on getting the public to care more about nature. And indeed, the facts around nature loss and extinction can create outrage that leads to change in our behaviors. But some are saying that the public is turning away from this kind of messaging. Do we need to deploy new narratives, ones that are less gloom and doom, if you will? What's your view?
I grew up seeing documentaries, seeing National Geographic magazines, all of these different sources of inspiration about biodiversity in the natural world. And when I first started having the opportunity to travel and visit these places, I was seeing a different reality. I remember the first time I flew to Borneo and actually seeing deforestation from the plane at the scale at the time with some of the highest rates of deforestation in the world. And that not only wasn't being conveyed in the global ways that it needed to be, but it also, came to realize that that doom and gloom aspect was 100% of the tone with which we lived in the conservation world. And you would take whatever small victories you could have, and morale was often pretty low. I think that was kind of the norm for a long time. When I got into the storytelling space, working on different documentaries. Actually, Borneo is a good example because at one point I had the opportunity to work on a David Attenborough series that was filmed in Borneo. And given the opportunity, I asked him this because we were filming a documentary about the sheer biodiversity on that island. And I was like, outside of this space, outside of this protected area where we're working, there are some pretty grave aspects around ecosystem degradation and loss. And he was like, yeah, if you go too hard into that, though, you're going to lose your viewers. And I always felt that there's somewhere of a balance to be found. And I actually committed a lot of my storytelling thereafter to try to figure out what is that right balance. Understanding the threshold of too much doom and gloom is it disengages people and you lose the opportunity to bring more people along. But we don't have time, as things maybe used to be, to inspire the next generation to fix challenges that we're facing today. We still need to inspire the next generation. But I think for me, that really brought it down to the last few years. I've really been focused on how do we incentivize and accelerate solutions now. And so transforming a lot of that frustration into, what can we urgently do to, whether it's about breakthroughs or changing mindsets. But I think the movement that we have going now is much more people waking up and realizing, if we do everything that we can in our capability, there is at least a positive angle that's brought to the equation. So um, I think there certainly needs to be a point of engagement, a way in which everybody can feel that they can contribute and not turn people away. But then I think it needs to be focused on solutions. So if I think the take home here on this one is if we just keep blasting news about the negative side of things without offering solutions or conveying how people can be part of the solution, then it's a missed opportunity.
Now, as you know, one of the reasons why so much nature loss has occurred is because of economic development, because business in places like Borneo, but also in the Congo, Latin America, where there are great stands of tropical forests, which you are very familiar with, they have been subject to a lot of deforestation because of economic imperatives. Um, this economic trade-off argument has been particularly powerful, and it suggests that nature conservation, our work, stands in the way of poverty reduction, job creation, and economic growth. What do you make of this narrative, and how do we either combat that narrative and or work with it?
I would say that there's so many things to unpack around economic drivers. Of course, where is the demand for those resources coming from in the first place? But also, I would say what we need to be focused on right now is sustainable development. And how do we actually empower people to make sound decisions, and actually also like how can those resources benefit people to protect their own natural resources and ensure that they're there for the future. So I feel that the movement is coming about to realizing this. There need to be economic incentives to invest in the future of the planet to ensure that it's around for the future. The short-term economic gains clearly has not been working, but that is often the way that we've seen, whether it's with corporations or different countries, it's often maximizing profit in a very short-term sense. And so I do think that there is an opportunity now to actually see we have the biggest asset class on the planet itself. And how can we ensure that sustainably those resources that we do depend on as a species, as a civilization, are there in the future?
Now, you use the word asset, and I'm thinking now of a recent Asia Development Bank report that talks about nature as being vital infrastructure, an essential asset for economic stability and resilience. Is labeling nature as an economic asset or as infrastructure involve any trade-offs that we should be wary of?
I'm a little bit less concerned about that. I do think that we need to broaden our horizons a little bit more in terms of how we explain what nature really is. And a couple years ago, the infrastructure word triggered this, but the United States actually had declared coral reefs as national natural infrastructure. And it was an interesting angle to convey that we should be protecting coral reefs for the benefits that they provide in terms of resilience, coastal resilience and stability, fisheries, even national security matters. And so and thereafter I saw how different conversations were being held and people were referencing that, and people understand investing in infrastructure. If you look at, tropical rainforests, they are the infrastructure of significant proportions of, equatorial world. And so I try to think about these things differently as well. As we invest in infrastructure in our urban concrete jungles, and we protect that, and we look at ways of mitigating emergency response and things like that. We need to begin thinking about our planet in terms of that kind of resilience, that kind of protection. We focus so much on national security. I think if we framed things in terms of planetary security and resilience in a more holistic sense, these types of things begin to make sense. And I think that more people may come on board because we're meeting, I don't know about halfway, but we're meeting in some kind of middle about how to explain the problem and come up with solutions.
Yeah, agreed. Allow me to pivot for a moment. As you know, in 2022, the UN General Assembly recognized the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. How might this relatively new human right be fully leveraged to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, in your opinion?
It almost seems intuitive in terms of these are rights that we should all um, ensure exist for everybody on the planet. But that certainly and obviously is not the case. Um, but I also think of all of these matters in terms of we are a species. We exist in this world. I don't think that it is viewed in that way as often, but we have a natural habitat and we are more interconnected than ever. I think COVID-19 is an excellent example of just how fragile our entire species can be because of how interconnected we are. There are obviously many pros and cons, but we're vulnerable. And so I think that at the bare minimum, having those rights is critical to our own survival. And I don't, it's a little hypocritical to say something so doom and gloom after the previous question we just talked about, but I worry about the future existence of our own species if we don't begin to focus more on these types of matters, on a different mentality. How do we ensure that we as a species thrive and exist in the future? I think we need to make some different decisions.
In terms of changing mentalities, I'm wondering, is there anything that you think we could learn from the women's rights movement, the labor rights movement, or other social movements of the past?
Certainly. And I think the synergy there is certainly around movements and how do we coalesce and bring people together. That is certainly something that I think various successful movements, especially in the latter half of the last century, gained a lot of traction around and success. I feel that recently there is a different focus and energy, perhaps because of the urgency. There were certain things that were being warned about in the 60s and 70s that essentially all have played out by now. Um, I think that there's this other wave of true realization of planetary crises and tipping points that is activating a movement again. What I would maybe seek to learn from those historical examples that you mentioned is the interdisciplinary composition of who is part of that movement. We need everybody involved in this across different sectors, across different countries, and not just the usual suspects within a given field trying to solve a given problem. So that's probably what I would look towards is what are our blind spots in this sense, and who else do we need to bring to the table?
Um, Speaking of bringing people to the table, I understand you've been deeply involved in the X Prize Rainforest competition, and if I understand things correctly, in this competition, teams are awarded for designing and deploying technologies to better understand and protect tropical forests. Uh, how can this technology and or engagement of technology be leveraged to increase the value we place on nature? What might be some examples?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was at X Prize for 5 years and joined to run that prize, and that was really the mission, was not monitoring just for the sake of monitoring, but how can we monitor in a way that communicates the value of standing tropical forests and communicate in that sense that it is truly better to invest in thriving ecosystems that there's a big focus in Brazil with that prize. It was funded by a Brazilian foundation, the Alana Foundation. And within Brazil, there's a big focus on bioeconomies, just and sustainable bioeconomies. And you need monitoring to understand that. And so the premise of all of that was very in line with what we're talking about. We started that competition. It was a $10 million prize. It was launched just at the start of the pandemic and was awarded at the G20 in Brazil end of 2024. And throughout that journey, we had 300 teams from 70 countries that all embarked on that journey with us to really develop new, novel technological approaches to monitoring tropical forests over a vast area in near real time and produce insights about the health, the well-being, and the value of standing tropical forests. So that was really at the heart of the whole mission and ethos as we built that out and operated it. As I mentioned, we awarded that. There were 6 finalist teams after we did a semifinal testing in Singapore in 2023, and then a finals in the Brazilian Amazon in 2024. And all of those teams really have been going on to do amazing things, and it's phenomenal to see. So to me, that was a movement. That was a global ecosystem of partners that we made sure to involve and partner with indigenous communities, heads of state, ministers of environment, academic institutions, tech companies. It was really a beautiful ecosystem, and I began using that term as a biologist because an ecosystem is a thriving, interacting communities of species on the landscape. And it's funny because other sectors use the term ecosystem now, but that's really what is necessary for what we're talking about. And we launched many amazing prizes at the organization over those years. And actually, at the beginning of last year, I moved on to actually build out something new on how we can continue to scale up and implement solutions.
Peter, thank you so much for being with us here today, and I'm looking forward to watching the rest of your work unfold over the course of 2026 and beyond.
Thank you, Sean.
A powerful narrative can shape beliefs, but final test is whether it shifts behaviours at a systemic level as well. Here we see a persistent disconnect, leaders and institutions publicly championing the value of nature, yet destructive economic and policy decisions continuing to be made. This suggests that sometimes these high-level actions are shaped less by stated conviction and more by the very architecture of the systems within which these leaders are operating. To explore this, our next conversation is with Brett Jenks, an expert in behavioural science and systems design. Hosting this discussion is Terence Hay Eddy, UNDP's Programme Manager for Local Action, Indigenous Peoples and Nature.
We can't impose conservation.
How do you connect coalitions?
Humans tend to have a single action bias.
It's normal to have a series of experiments.
Conservation doesn't work unless it is co-created, co-managed.
How do you allow for that experimentation and the learning to be built into your project design? And
almost all environmental problems are caused by one species.
Well, it's great to be back in touch, Brett, after many years. And so what we'd like to talk about today is the subject of behavior change and these wicked problems that don't seem to go away in terms of attitudes and behaviors. So maybe just to get us started, Brett, what in your opinion is keeping not just leaders, but society as a whole from acting on these commitments? And
we set big targets, and big, ambitious, visionary targets and aspirations for nature, and they tend to translate to square kilometers of area under protection. And so we end up with a 30 by 30 vision, which says we should be protecting 30% of nature by 2030. And the way you end up implementing and executing on a plan like that is to go out and find the biggest places you can and put them under legal protection through some regulation and some regulatory body. And of course, there's nothing wrong with the concept of protecting 30% of nature. But if you then go visit a protected area that has been created in the last 20 or 30 years, in each community, in each protected area, you see a microcosm of this global challenge. And that is, I have visited parks in my career where people didn't even know that they lived in a protected area, where it's literally news to them that the area around them is now protected. And I think fundamentally, it's a flaw in the way that we think about biodiversity conservation. And so a couple of the really big things that are missing. People change for three reasons. People change when they see other people change. People change when they believe other people expect them to change. And then people change really quickly, and they overcome all of their logical obstacles to change when they feel that the rate of change is accelerating. And so what does that have to do with biodiversity? What I would say is people generally don't see, it's not a norm. Generally speaking, we don't have a norm, a social norm globally around protection of, curation of, stewardship of nature, with some fundamental outlying, and really positive exceptions. There's a lot of indigenous people who have long protected and engaged with nature in ways that are quite different from the Western world today.
so I think we'll be talking about these questions of social norms, culture, behavior from different angles. But just to take us back to the comment you made about hectares. So under the last set of biodiversity goals, there was a lot of attention given to the area-based target around protecting 17% of the earth, and now we have a 30% target. And what we've seen there, of course, is a broadening of the inclusion of a much wider range of governance types, including indigenous territories as a third pathway. So this whole notion of what a protected or a conserved area is now being massively reinterpreted through advocacy from indigenous peoples. In the current Jeff 8 cycle, for the first time, we saw a focus on behavior change, stemming from this realization that other types of project or program design were not working, and an interest to involve more social science approaches. Is how do you balance this need for understanding on behavior change from then the more sort of driven, purpose-led objectives?
The simple answer is we shouldn't be doing conservation to people. We should be co-creating conservation strategies with people. We'd love to protect 50% of the planet because it would benefit future generations. But 30% is an incredibly ambitious start. But again, the problem is when you start off with your objective being the creation of a protected area, to your point, you end up designing a project with only that outcome in mind. And humans, tend to have a single action bias. We tend to believe there's one way to solve a problem, or there's one strategy, there's one choice, and we need to focus on hectares, or we need to focus on volume of protection. When in reality, biodiversity doesn't necessarily work like that, and people certainly don't work like that. And I'll give you a really good example from our experience at Rare. About 12 years ago, we started working on coastal fisheries and coastal habitats. And we did that because a number of organizations had come to us to say, coastal waters are a tragedy of the commons. Everyone's racing to catch the last fish. We were really reluctant to dig in because we had seen just how difficult this work was, but we decided to. And we created a group of pilots. The first thing we did was, Terrence, we went around the world and we held a competition, and we identified, essentially the positive deviants. And by that, I mean the bright spots where certain communities had figured out how to restore their own fisheries. And so we took these bright spots and we built a portfolio of locally led solutions. So you can talk about it in economic terms, or you can listen to the stories of locals, which are going to resonate far more with local people themselves. And so that became the rallying cry. Can we, the people of the Philippines, can we, the local fisher folk, restore our own waters such that we can fish the way our grandparents did? And so in those particular communities, using locally developed solutions like no-take zones, like bans on certain kinds of mesh sizes for fishing nets, by agreeing not to fish in spawning aggregation areas, by agreeing not to net the mouths, the estuaries, so that the nurseries would be protected. They created their own surveillance units and they protected their own waters. What that did was create a new social norm, one that basically let everyone conclude, because they could see it on the water, oh, this is what people like me do now. That may sound like fantasy or social fiction, but what I will say is, from those three pilots, we had mayors then who said, this is working and our people are excited about it. They went and talked to other mayors who then started adopting a similar program. So the mayors now are able to pass local ordinances that put into local law the rules that have been established by these local fisher folk. We've gone in 12 years from 3 communities to more than 2,000 communities.
So maybe we'll come back to this question of coalitions that you alluded to in terms of fisher folk with mayors and kind of transnational civil society networks around these topics of co-management or shared governance. How do you connect coalitions, and do you have any reflections on how we can take the lessons from Rare and from these approaches and have other institutions adopt them?
In our experience, we have seen the power of looking for what's already working. Coalitions are really powerful because often people come together, or the act of people coming together to create a coalition is the act of codifying what that group of people values. And so if you're able to build a network of people around a shared set of values and solutions, then you get science-backed, socially acceptable, locally created solutions. If that's your value system and you have toolkits and you have money to build capacity, well, then you have a much better chance of actually scaling solutions that are more likely to be successful. And in reality, conservation, in my experience, doesn't work unless it is co-created co-managed, and becomes part of the cultural and social fabric of a population that is going to benefit long term from the stewardship of nature. We can't impose conservation.
So this question of emergence in complex systems is social emergence is at the center of this. So that by adopting a coalition-based approach where multiple actors are constantly changing positions, I think there is a greater chance that in the mix of different solution seekers that the solutions will stick in the longer term. One key phrase we keep hearing now in the Jeff 9 replenishment is whole of society, as well as whole of government, which implies what we're talking about today in terms of coalitions. But whole of society is pretty hard to achieve at the national level. So one thing I've heard Carlos Manuel, the Jeff CEO, talk about is whole of society at the subnational level. Does that resonate with the work that you do in RARE?
Yeah, for a variety of reasons, it does resonate. One of the things that we can do is to enable every practitioner on planet Earth who's working with communities and working with local leaders at the subnational level to design conservation strategies that leverage behavioral science. Principally, three fundamental pillars. One is emotional appeals. We need to make our insights much more emotionally appealing. We need to make biodiversity conservation something that grabs people by the heart. Second, we need to think about social incentives. When a community sees other community members changing, they're way more likely to change. You can design social incentives as a part of any conservation project. First, though, a practitioner needs to know, what does that look like? What does that mean? What are some other examples and some other stories where people have leveraged emotional appeals and social incentives? And then ultimately, you need to create choice design. How do you make it easy? The same way you think about, exiting a building. There's a sign that says exit, and intuitively that's where you go. Or recycling. Here's composting, and here's a plastic container. It's much easier to do if you have a little sign, a little nudge in that direction. Those are three very basic high-level pillars in which there are thousands of examples and practices that are simply not the norm. We like to describe it this way. Most conservation leaders, most conservation practitioners studied a habitat, studied a species, studied nature. Almost all environmental problems are caused by one species, and that's us, human beings. But how many conservationists studied behavioral economics, social psychology, neuroscience? So if we're going to save nature, we've got to study human behavior just as much as we study gorillas or dolphins or aspen groves. That's the fundamental insight that we need to embrace.
How do you allow for that experimentation and the learning, the iterations of learning to be built into your project design? And it sounds really boring and mundane, but just to allow midway through a project a course correction is actually one way of doing that. That the assumptions before you started implementation have to change after 1 or 2 years.
One of the great frustrations of any nonprofit practitioner is the fact that most of the assessment of your project is done based on a plan that was designed 3 years ago when the proposal was written. And so having to explain to a donor, especially donors that are reluctant to give you the freedom to go iterate, is incredibly not only frustrating. It's just counterproductive. It's funny because RARE now has a portfolio of for-profit businesses, and in addition to nonprofit businesses. And in the for-profit arena, there's an agreement that you're developing a product, you're developing a service, you're pivoting every single week. You're pivoting, you're changing, and you're allowed to change because your job is to return resources with a successful business to your investors. And so nobody has a hang up about shifting course, provided you get a really clear outcome, which basically says, before you hire an assistant, before you open an office, before you hire staff, before you worry about your logo, does your product solve a problem for a consumer? Number one, is your consumer willing to pay more for the product than it cost you to deliver it? And are there many others out there who are willing to do the same, to buy your product? And if the answer to those three questions is yes, well, then you might have a viable business. Think about how different that is from, we're going to protect 1 million square kilometers out there. And maybe we're going to go out and talk to the people who live there about whether or not they think that's a good idea. And here's $10 million. I mean, it just juxtaposed those two ideas. And that's one of the challenges we face when we don't, in the for-profit arena, you buy shares in a stock. You're buying a tiny piece of a company, but you don't have any say in whether that goes to the corporate retreat or the logo or the swag or a line item for marketing, in Uzbekistan. And yet we believe that as donors, we should be determining which line items we should fund and which we shouldn't, and assuming we know best. I mean, I understand accountability. But this is the system we operate in. But yeah, I hear you, and I agree with you. We have a lot of work to do.
It's just normal to have a series of experiments until you get past the hypotheses which didn't turn out to be correct. So,
and the same is true. The same is true in commerce. Take Roblox, huge video game studio worth $50 billion. For 7 years, they failed. And then eventually they found a product and a market fit. And now they're worth, $50 billion. The last thing I will say to you, Terrence, about this is an additional behavior change, let's just say institutionally, that we should all be considering is outcomes-based finance. In a way, outcomes-based finance would enable us to be as creative and entrepreneurial as the private sector, while still being able to set a course and a direction towards the kind of outcomes for nature and people that we desire.
Thanks for your time, Brick.
Our final dialogue brings us to a perspective that is too often overlooked, but absolutely essential. Indigenous peoples and local communities safeguard a vast portion of the world's remaining and most valuable biodiversity. Their stewardship is a lived relationship with nature, grounded in generations of knowledge. As the global community seeks to partner with these communities, we must far more critically examine the contours of these partnerships. To do so, we are honoured to be joined by Siena Duval, the coordinator of the Environmental Management Department of the Indigenous Council of Roraima, Brazil, and co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus of the COP30 Special Envoy. For over a decade, Siena has been a powerful advocate working on the front lines of climate discussions to ensure that local environmental and territorial actions are included within appropriate public policies for Indigenous peoples. Hosting this discussion is Anna Medri, Team Lead and Partnerships Advisor for the Equator Initiative here at UNDP.
Que o termo parceiro é você ter também uma ligação de confiança, né?
Uma discrepância entre o que os povos indígenas e as instituições realmente entendem por uma boa parceria.
A gente tem que olhar muito a questão política interna, como as comunidades se organizam.
Onde é que a compreensão do consentimento livre, prévio informado geralmente falha entre a política e a realidade?
É a metodologia de construir junto. Então é um trabalho em conjunto. Eu vou muito dessa perspectiva de construir junto.
Olá, Siena, seja bem-vinda e obrigada por se juntar a mim aqui hoje. temos alguns minutos juntas para conversar sobre parcerias. Parcerias entre povos indígenas e governos, setor privado e instituições internacionais. Porque muitas vezes ouço líderes falarem sobre parceria, mas sei que essa palavra pode ter significados muito diferentes na prática. Então, quero saber como você realmente se sente em relação a isso.
Olá, Luna, muito obrigada. Muito obrigada pelo convite para falar desse tema tão importante. É um tema onde a gente vai abordar tanto parceiros, nacionais, parceiros internacionais, parceiros do governo, não governo. É muito importante dizer que para nós o tema e o termo parceria é você ser parceiro dos povos indígenas, apoiar nos seus modos de vida, naquilo que eles já estão fazendo, nas suas terras, na sua cultura, na vivência dos povos indígenas. Então, ter essas parcerias são apoios onde realmente fortaleça cada vez na área do direito, na área de educação, na área da saúde. Então, o termo parceria não significa, porque dá um tom que você ter um parceiro é você fazer um trabalho junto, é um trabalho sempre respeitando de ambas as partes, tratar de uma metodologia, de uma interação, onde a gente aplica junto com os povos indígenas, uma metodologia de fortalecimento do trabalho que já tem feito. E nessa parceria é muito importante dizer que o termo parceiro é você ter também uma ligação de confiança, né? Ter um trabalho junto, ter uma relação de confiança, porque não apenas você só aporta recursos para implementar ações que melhorem a qualidade de vida dos povos indígenas, mas a gente busca realmente ter confiança mútua, né? Nos parceiros que estão nos ajudando a fortalecer em todos os âmbitos do trabalho que os povos indígenas vêm fazendo pelo bem viver, de todos os povos indígenas, em qualquer espaço que nós possamos estar. Então, ser parceiro, principalmente de órgãos governamentais, ser parceiro principalmente, de eh, organizações que também criam esse vínculo de parceria junto com os povos indígenas. A gente traz nesse momento, esse nome para nós, parceria é como um ajuri. O que que é um ajuri? É você se juntar para fazer um trabalho juntos para a melhoria, dos povos indígenas. Então, trazendo, na perspectiva dos povos indígenas, quando a gente adquirir um parceiro, é justamente para que possa fortalecer todo o trabalho que é feito pelos povos indígenas.
Muito obrigada, Cineia. Então, pelo que eu entendo, pelo que eu observei no meu trabalho, há uma lacuna, uma discrepância entre o que os povos indígenas e as instituições realmente entendem por uma boa parceria. E aprendi que essa lacuna nem sempre tem a ver com más intenções, mas com a forma como as decisões são realmente tomadas. Qual é a sua perspectiva sobre isso?
Implementa projetos, em terras indígenas, que é o que mais acontece nas parcerias, e principalmente de órgãos públicos, né? A tendência é que chegue para nós um formulário que diz como vai ser implementado aquele projeto e traz algumas regras sem antes conversar com os povos indígenas, para dizer para eles, olha, isso está de acordo com a vivência de vocês, né? Isso a gente pode trabalhar junto para construir uma metodologia onde a gente possa implementar essa questão de ser parceiros, né? Mas também a gente não impor e deixar uma grande lacuna de trabalho juntos. Então, sempre, eu fiz, por exemplo, na minha tese de mestrado, eu fiz, um trabalho onde eu consigo balizar como as pessoas não indígenas podem trabalhar com os povos indígenas, como elas podem chegar e fazer um trabalho e construir uma proposta, né, de implementar ações, de fortalecer o trabalho que já tem sido feito e tendo essa confiança mútua. Porque se você não tiver, uma confiança mútua entre o que você está fazendo, é provável que o resultado para ambas as partes, ele não seja um resultado que realmente possa, ser um resultado positivo ou um resultado de sucesso.
Claro. Então, quando as organizações dizem que querem ser parceiras, qual é para você o primeiro sinal que você procura para saber se isso é genuíno ou não?
Ele tem uma relação de confiança com povos indígenas. É saber se eles querem respeitar o direito dos povos indígenas, dizer como é que eles têm construído, né, os seus trabalhos e como ele quer estar nessa parceria. É muito importante a gente ouvir sobre isso, porque muitas vezes, e aí eu quero dar alguns exemplos, chega recursos ou projetos de cima para baixo. A gente tem um projeto para apoiar povos indígenas, mas vocês têm que fazer dessa forma como está no quadradinho. Vocês não podem sair desse quadrado. E muitas vezes a gente quer dizer: olha, apesar de ter vindo quadrado, a gente quer trabalhar essa parceria meio que oval, onde a gente possa realmente, né, numa perspectiva de fortalecer o trabalho que a gente faz, fortalecer nossos direitos, né? Então, há uma conversa por trás dessa questão da parceria. Ser parceiro é você criar uma relação de confiança, não tem jeito de fugir disso, né. E muitas vezes, em instituições, nós criamos essa relação de confiança com pessoas e felizmente, nem todos que estão dentro de uma instituição, eles têm a desenvoltura para trabalhar com povos indígenas, e são poucas as pessoas que se identificam para trabalhar com povos indígenas. Então a gente cria em todas as instituições praticamente, principalmente governamentais, são pessoas que têm uma desenvoltura para trabalhar com povos indígenas.
Então, você falou sobre isso um pouco antes. O consentimento livre, prévio e informado é muito discutido e, como sabemos bem, é uma das principais salvaguardas dos direitos e da autodeterminação dos povos indígenas, garantindo essencialmente que eles possam tomar suas próprias decisões sobre o que acontece em suas terras e territórios. Agora, na sua experiência, onde é que a compreensão do consentimento livre, prévio informado geralmente falha entre a política e a realidade? O que as pessoas e instituições erram quando tentam aplicá-lo?
Por exemplo, em terras indígenas, é que se começa primeiro um empreendimento para depois fazer uma consulta. E aí já começa a quebrar a regra, por exemplo, da 169. Porque fazer uma consulta por fazer, sem você atentar para a questão do resultado da consulta, se vai seguir ou não, né, eu acho que ali já começa a descumprir a 169. E essa questão de vocês fazer primeiro o empreendimento, né, em alguns casos eu já vi, faz primeiro o empreendimento, depois vai fazer a consulta. Quando vai fazer a consulta, tá uma questão já descontrolada. Então tem, né, questões judiciais, já tem pessoas que já foram, impactada com esse empreendimento. Isso poderia ser evitado a partir do momento que a consulta viesse primeiro que o empreendimento. E a gente tem visto que isso não acontece. Uma das questões também é a questões de financiamento para fazer a consulta, porque muitas das organizações, né, e até mesmo organizações governamentais, as consultas são muito caras. Então, aí já começa também a descumprir o 69, porque teria que fazer a consulta a todos, da forma como está né, colocado lá no plano de consulta dos povos indígenas. E se não for cumprida,
Então, Cineia, você falou muito sobre responsabilidade, sobre confiança e tempo. Ao ouvi-la, parece que uma parceria verdadeira não se resume apenas em melhores políticas ou listas de verificação, mas sim a uma mudança em quem detém o poder, em quem lidera. Se os líderes estivessem realmente dispostos a fazer essa mudança, qual seria o compromisso, o comportamento que você gostaria de ver deles daqui para frente?
para que realmente qualquer um que vá fazer essa consulta, que vai fazer essa parceria, que vá ter um programa realmente, primeiramente ouça, né, aos povos indígenas nesse contexto, de saber realmente como se organiza, como é a política interna deles, o que realmente eles gostariam de ser apoiado, porque às vezes a gente tem diretrizes que diz, olha, eu quero implementar aqui uma tecnologia de ponta e que vai melhorar aí a qualidade de vida do monitoramento. Mas primeiro você precisa conversar com a comunidade e perguntá-la: vocês gostariam de fazer esse monitoramento? Vocês gostariam de trabalhar com outras tecnologias que não seja a sabedoria indígena? Se isso for de interesse de vocês, a gente está aqui propondo que vamos ter uma parceria, seja com órgãos governamentais ou não, sejam com órgãos internacionais ou não, mas que a gente poderia fazer junto, construir essa proposta para que possa apoiar vocês. Como vocês pensam fazer esse monitoramento no território de vocês? Que é a metodologia de construir junto, não chegar com nada pronto. Quando você constrói junto, você consegue implementar algo consistente, onde todos ali sabem realmente o que estão trabalhando. Se estão trabalhando, né, na perspectiva da gestão do território, do controle territorial, da saúde, da educação. Então é um trabalho em conjunto. Eu vou muito dessa perspectiva de construir junto.
Então, Cineia, você vem realizando esse importante trabalho de defesa desde os 17 anos de idade. Você já viu de tudo. Eu quero saber hoje o que lhe dá a esperança de que as parcerias possam ser feitas de maneira diferente no futuro.
Mas o que me dá esperança das parcerias, que eu acho que agora muito mais parceiros começaram a entender como trabalhar com os povos indígenas. Começaram a entender a questão do tempo, a questão da confiança mútua, né? Começaram a entender que povos indígenas a gente precisa construir junto. Então, eu já vi alguns parceiros e algumas organizações internacionais falando na questão da desburocratização de recurso para organizações indígenas. Então, quando tudo isso vem, né, agora nesse contexto, né, de um pouco tempo para cá, eu vejo que algumas pessoas estão mudando a concepção de trabalhar com a organização, com povos indígenas, com terras indígenas, e o que me dá esperança é que as pessoas começaram a entender que trabalhar com povos indígenas é isso, é você conseguir fazer, né, uma parceria onde os 2 lados têm que ser respeitados. Tempo dos povos indígenas, direito dos povos indígenas, burocracia dos parceiros, tempo dos parceiros, a questão burocrática de prestação de contas, né. Então eu acho que toda essa questão, ela vem a cada dia mais, os parceiros vêm tendo um aprendizado mútuo, né, porque tudo isso era muito novo. As pessoas chegavam para trabalhar com os povos indígenas: "Olha, a gente tem um projeto, mas tem 1 ano para vocês implementar". E aí eu falo muitas vezes de projeto realmente, até projetos da ONU, internacionais, né, que chegam, para povos indígenas: "Olha, nós temos projetos emergenciais, tem que terminar em 6 meses". E aí muitas vezes a gente ficava olhando, eu digo: "Não consegue terminar em 6 meses". O tempo não é o mesmo tempo que eles estão pensando. A gente pode estar até numa emergência, mas o tempo das comunidades realizar as ações ou de fazer qualquer outro trabalho é outro. Então, eu acho que a esperança é que cada vez mais as organizações comecem a perceber metodologicamente como eles podem, né, ir se adequando um com o outro para fazer com que as parcerias sejam realmente boas, né, para ambas as partes, não só para os povos indígenas, mas que eles entendam que os povos indígenas são diferentes, que a gente precisa cumprir ao 69, que existe protocolos, né, dos povos indígenas de consulta, que existe várias ferramentas construídas por indígena que baliza implementações de ações nas terras indígenas. E a gente tem aí planos de vida, plano de gestão territorial ambiental, a gente tem aí os planos de adaptação às mudanças climáticas, protocolos de consulta, né? Então, a gente tem muitas ferramentas construídas por indígenas que hoje vão balizar todas essas parcerias que vier para as terras indígenas. É muito importante dizer que, claro, cada dia a gente vai mais se adaptando, vai se organizando melhor para que as pessoas possam entender que os povos indígenas passaram a construir seus próprios mecanismos de implementação de ações. E é muito importante, cada parceiro, quando chega a uma organização, a uma terra indígena, a um povo, ele sempre pergunta qual é a forma política de se organizar internamente, porque é essa forma que eles precisam trazer para dentro da parceria. É sempre como eu digo em relação ao plano de gestão, não existe uma receita pronta, mas nós podemos criar, né, vários canal de entendimento sobre a questão das ferramentas que os povos indígenas têm construído para a questão das garantia do direito, né? Da garantia do direito das mulheres, dos jovens. É muito importante dizer que tudo isso tem que estar no contexto de uma parceria. Parceria de tempo, a gente tem que olhar muito a questão política interna, como as comunidades se organizam. Ao chegar numa comunidade, as pessoas possam observar sobre quem são as pessoas que estão ali à disposição para conversar sobre o assunto. É muito importante também uma questão da tradução, mas a tradução que eu digo é que muitas vezes o parceiro chega na comunidade, ele fala de uma forma do projeto ou do programa, como se a comunidade já tivesse ouvido falar sobre aquilo. Ele precisa traduzir isso em palavras simples, onde as comunidades possam entender o que realmente o parceiro está querendo falar. Ele vai trazer o intérprete, ele vai dizer de forma mais simples o que ele está querendo falar sobre mitigação, adaptação. Com essas palavras é difícil você fazer um diálogo numa comunidade. Então, é uma dica que, para qualquer programa, qualquer parceria, você tem que fazer uma tradução daquilo que você gostaria que essa comunidade entendesse ou que vocês dialogassem sobre isso. E isso é uma metodologia muito importante que a gente aprendeu também na vivência, né? A gente traduzir daqui para lá e ouvir a tradução de lá para cá, para que a gente possa ter uma proposta consistente.
Muito obrigada, Cineia, por se juntar a mim hoje. Foi um verdadeiro prazer.
Obrigada, Ana.
Over the past 3 days, we have journeyed through the great shifts required of our time for environmental action. We've confronted the architecture of finance, we've examined the mechanics of policy, and now the value shift tackles the very heart of the matter. What we've found is that this human dimension is a profound challenge, a challenge where narratives shape what is politically possible, where the design of our institutions is influencing high-level decisions, and where the question of whose knowledge and rights is centred is determining the justice and durability of outcomes. The conclusion then is no easy answer. It is that this is where our most essential work for systemic change truly lies. We invite you to continue your learning on the Nature for Life Hub platform. The curated learning journeys you'll find here are an opportunity to delve deeper into these topics at your own pace. Let's now carry these insights forward to become all ourselves the storytellers, the systems builders, the allies who will forge a future where both people and nature thrive. Thank you so much for being a part of Nature for Life Hub.